Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host for this episode. Feel free to comment, like, and share this video with your friends, colleagues, and on social media. If you like our programs and would like to see these shows before they go up on YouTube and our podcast channels, as well as enjoy exclusive videos, drawings, and to help us create more content, please consider joining our Patreon community, patreon.com/thought-to-action. Also, find out more about what the London Center is doing, the London Center for Policy Research, on our website, londoncenter.org. By now, many of you have heard of the Great Reset, a plan coming out of the World Economic Forum and its CEO, Klaus Schwab. A sugar-coated description of the plan is on the organization's website. It's heralded by many on the left and criticized by many on the right. Today, leaders from the London Center are here with me for a special Thought to Action roundtable delving into what the Great Reset really is, the consequences, and what it will take for its advocates to implement it. With me are London Center President, Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Schaefer, Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel British Army retired Tim Wilson, and Senior Fellow Brian Griffin. Gentlemen, let's start here. The Great Reset. We hear the harmonious version of it from Klaus Schwab, and we see the PR about it on the World Economic Forum website. Let's give our viewers and listeners an overview on the Great Reset, how it came about, and why it's gaining more popularity in some circles these days.
Thanks for doing this, Chris. Thanks for the audience joining us. And I just want to open by saying, let's build back better the London Center for the sake of the world. Let's tear everything down. That's the basic idea behind the Great Reset, is that somehow the very fabric of society that we enjoy, there's something wrong with it. And I think it's grandly ironic that the very people who benefit from the success of the global society are essentially saying there's something wrong and therefore you have to reset. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Griffin, who's really the intellectual engine behind the London Center, for him to kind of go through and let him describe what this really is.
Thanks, Tony. I think you set the stage very well here. The Great Reset is a term that's being used to describe restructuring society, the world's system of economics. So here's the backstory on that. A man named Klaus Schwab founded something called the World Economic Forum. And if you Google the World Economic Forum today, you will see right on the main page a large subthread dedicated to their idea, which is the Great Reset. In fact, Klaus Schwab also wrote a book. His book was titled, and it's available on Amazon, COVID-19, The Great Reset. Right? That was an introduction to the idea of how this Great Reset might come about. Now, to give you an idea of what some of the members of the World Economic Forum are talking about, here's some quotes directly from their own writing. An article by forum member Mark Dumba is titled, "The Great Reset Must Place Social Justice at its Center." And he says, quote, "Wealth needs to be more broadly redistributed. Capitalism as we know it needs to be reformed." Welcome to 2030, writes another forum member. This Danish member of parliament, Ida Auken. "Welcome to my city, or should I say our city. I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes." And in the last article, as an example, which is titled "Now is the Time for a Great Reset" by Schwab himself, he says, quote, "Every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism." So the idea is not a voluntary one. The idea is a compulsory reordering of the world's economic systems, where the free market, or what they're terming capitalism, is exchanged for whatever these people, these thinkers, these members of this World Economic Forum, and whatever political cronies they may have in power, get to restructure society, government, and economics that benefits their view of the world. And make no mistake about it, this is authoritarianism cloaked as a noble goal. You'll hear them talk about redistributing wealth and making things more fair, more just, and more equal, but they are doing away with the very bedrock of what has created the most freedom, fairness, justice, and equality that the world has seen over the course of humanity, which is freedom, democratic systems of government, and the free exchange on a free and open market. And at its core, that's what the Great Reset purports to do.
As I listen to you talking about the principles that the World Economic Forum is putting forward for this Great Reset, what immediately strikes me is how Marxist those principles are and how proud they are, for example, to tout the fact that somebody doesn't own a house, a car, have material possessions, which is, of course, very much the same communist propaganda, that the reality of which is it ends up with equal misery for all. But they claim that this is the only fair way, and the term fair is a fascinating one.
Right.
And it's embarrassing to me that people like Prince Charles help to front this sort of movement. Especially, you know, there is a guy who talked about born with a silver spoon. No, this is a guy born with a golden spoon in his mouth. And yet he's talking about some system of wealth redistribution to produce a sustainable world result. The link between the environmental movements and Marxism is, to me, extremely clear as a result of this proposal of a Great Reset. It's also interesting that the World Economic Forum, when it meets, has an invitation and guest list that is very much of the world elites. It is not something where the common man is easily accessible to the common man, and ordinary people are even allowed on the premises. If you think about what's involved in that, and if you look at every communist regime around the world, what you are talking about is very much a redistribution of wealth where the vast majority of hardworking people lose out, and the elites that control these societies become super elites with enormous privileges. And, you know, for example, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Chairman Xi, does not actually own very much at all. He just happens to have a bank account that is almost infinitely large because he can demand any amount of money from the Central Bank of China for his own benefit or for any other benefit, as long as he claims it's for the good of the Chinese people.
Exactly. Well, that's the issue. And there was an organization called the Comintern that existed in the, I believe it was the 20s and 30s, which essentially was established by the Soviet, as a hint, that was supposed to be essentially the font of all revolution to bring the benefits of communism to the people of the world. Well, this is indeed, by all description, by its own doctrine, the Comintern of the 21st century. I don't know if anybody agrees with me on that or not, but I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And the idea here is that instead of moving forward with essentially a militaristic view, as the Soviets were bent to do because of the way they expressed Marxism, the heavy-handed idea of armies marching has been replaced by the very subdued but very effective use of technology, of big tech, as the vector of delivery. And the delivery is very smooth. It's very sophisticated. It's almost a siren song because it promises to deliver answers to all the ills of the world and to bring benefit to all people. It's a lie. And I think we have to recognize the danger of this lie. And I think we as we've already pointed out, this is, I believe, we'll be doing, this will be first of a series of the Great Reset regarding concepts. And I think that there's several broad categories that we'll break down and explore in more detail. First, is has already been said by my colleagues, is the environmental movement. The environmental movement, for those who pay attention to the London Center, I actually have a degree in environmental studies. And I can tell you, as someone who has credentials in this area, it's a fraud. Many of the concepts which were developed in the 1970s, which said we were going into a global cooling that would result in glaciers, are the same crowd now who shout about climate warming that's going to result in the diminution of our ability as a society to move forward. It's all junk science. Many predicted something called peak oil, that we would all be out of oil by the early 2000s and we would be unable to sustain our society. It was completely wrong. It was alarmist for no reason other than trying to find a way to justify government control of resources. That's what this is all about. And I think the idea is also said by Brian, is that so much of the concept is you don't own anything. Nothing you need has to be owned. The state will provide everything. You don't have to worry. It's all on them, not you. And I think this is the second factor, is the economic deception that's going on that we have to explore. The idea that the state, the party, has any authority to do what it thinks is best for the people based on it's the party. And the economic exclusion of anyone who disagrees with the party becomes very apparent through this system within China, of where your social standing is linked to your ability to generate and maintain income or status. Because if you do something that goes against the state, you're not a good citizen, you aren't due resources. Again, going back to the original concepts of Marx. So that's another area we'll be exploring.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you'll notice, Klaus Schwab throws in little let's put it this way, little noble concepts. At least he's trying to sell his great reset by using terms like global citizenship or tying in environmental concerns like you were discussing, Tony. When this became a subject of debate, members of the media, the news media in the US and other information gatekeepers were quick to call it a conspiracy theory, even though Schwab was making speeches, has done interviews. It's all on YouTube. It's all over the place. It's all public. He's held forums focusing about the plan.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. The Great Reset is not being orchestrated by a shadowy cabal of people, even at the World Economic Forum. The problem with the Great Reset is that it's an idea that's being promoted using some grains of truth, but sold as something that it's not. Essentially, the Great Reset argues that if the people have less control over their own economic outcomes in life, and if fewer people are part of the decision-making process of the spending priorities of the world's governments, then the world's biggest problems are solved.
Right.
That's what the Great Reset really is. It's not something that seeks to tackle what they claim. Income inequality, environmentalism, the fallout from COVID, etc. I think those are all convenient talking points to introduce the idea of a Great Reset, which has much different goals. And here's the thing, Tony talks about the environmental movement. Tony, I think an important distinction to be made here is you're talking about the political environmental movement. We're not talking about the science.
I'm glad you brought that up. No, that there are clear and concise areas of concern we must all, as citizens, be concerned about.
Right.
The whole artificial island of plastic in the Pacific. We have bays being choked, wildlife being killed by this. But when is the last time the left ever talked about any of this? Because big corporations don't want to talk about the pollution being created by their push for consumerism. They don't want to talk about that.
That's right. So it's important to separate these political movements from the actual science and fact economics-based movements. The same thing with those who care about people increasing their their wealth and their standard of living. The same thing that goes to people who actually care about helping people experiencing the impact of COVID. It's not the Great Resetters. The Great Resetters are opportunists that are using this as an advantage to push their political agenda. There is more that can be done in all of the areas that the Great Resetters are claiming to capitalize on, claiming to own. There's more to be done for the standard of living people. There's more to be done for the environment. There's more to be done in response to COVID in the free market and in our current system of democratic representation and through liberty than there could ever be done through a top-down restructuring of the world's economies and through the elimination of capitalism. It's just, we know from human history, we know from the last 100 years that the great equalizer is the free market.
Right.
That the worst environmental entities with the worst track record are big government, China, and other big government entities. And that COVID is best, things like COVID crises are best responded to through the innovation that is offered uniquely through the free market. That's the way to tackle these issues, and the Great Resetters want you to believe otherwise, and that's the danger of it.
And to that point, Brian, very quickly, I know we have to wrap up here in a bit, but the two examples I like looking at regarding COVID responses, Florida versus New York. One was a very top-down, very heavy-handed, you will do this, that, and the other, which utterly destroyed the economy of New York and New York City. It has been devastating. And in Florida, you had a governor that went the other way. It's like, no, let's try to keep things unrestricted, let people make their own choices, let businesses actually do things. And that state is doing amazingly well. So I think the policy outcome is obvious due to the observables. It's there. You can just look at it. And to deny the facts, I think would make one a conspiracy theorist. And because the left always talks about conspiracies, yet it's interesting. It seems to me that they're the ones who actually participate and use these things to the greatest extent. And let me say something here that may get us in trouble. I think is absolutely true. One of the concepts has been put forth on both continents between us and Europe is the build back better. What does that mean? Since when did we have our society fail? What has to be built back? There's always room for improvement. There's always room for innovation. But the left tends not to innovate. They tend to amalgamate and restrict. So I'm not quite sure what the Biden campaign and the Biden folks are thinking when they talk about this idea of building back. And this, if you look at that rhetoric, it goes back directly to this larger construct of the Great Reset. The idea is to reset based on what they believe as politicians and government to dictate what it should be rather than allow innovation to take its own course. I don't know if you'd all agree with that, but I think that's a key feature.
It is interesting that the use of the sky is falling over and over has expanded from local politics very much into this whole globalist movement. And, the inequalities, the poverty in some regions and what have you, they have seized on those to try and spread their message. And the sky is not actually falling. You're quite right, Tony. Build America, build back better. Hang on. America is not a country that's in dire economic straits, even after COVID-19. And we've actually, to my mind, just seen a great example with the release of the vaccines in record time of the free markets working so well and central government control doing so badly.
Yeah. Well, one of the areas of the economic sector I enjoy monitoring is the rail networks within the United States. Early in last year, the rail companies took a hit just like everybody else because of diminished capacity based on the lack of market activity. If you don't have trains running goods if there's no goods, if nobody's buying goods. But they've roared back after 3 record bad quarters. They have now had 3 record good quarters of massive and continued need for rail transportation. That's not a country that is in decline does not have a massive increase of the need for rail. That speaks of an economy that's ready to jump back and grow very vigorously. Building back is not the answer. Allowing the economy to flourish in the direction it is already moving, that clearly is the answer. But it's the Great Reset. It's time that we stop everything and we allow the politicians to tell us what's best for us, because obviously they know better than us how we should live our lives.
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is whatever it's termed as, a Great Reset or building back better or whatever, always be wary of attempts to consolidate power. Always be wary of attempts to consolidate power. It's always worth speaking out against. It's always worth identifying the true motives of ideas like this. And I'll just say this, there's been, I think, one very successful Great Reset that is in stark contrast to what's being proposed by this new Great Reset. And that Great Reset was the Great Reset that America promulgated on the world stage when they decided to make people freer and give people more control over their lives and over the exchanges they make when America was founded and constitutionalized. That was a Great Reset that worked because it was founded in freedom. It was founded in bringing more people into the decision-making process and giving people more control over their lives. That's truly something that should be applauded. And that's, I think, is what is at stake here with this new concept of the Great Reset. This new concept is a reset that is in no way great and is in every way a consolidation of power.
So that's one of the things I think our audience will notice as we move forward in 2021 is the central benefit of innovation. And I would argue that innovation is created by what Brian just outlined relating to individual freedoms. And one of the key factors, and I see this term misused constantly, American exceptionalism is not about Americans being better than anyone else. It's about the fact that Americans benefit from more personal freedoms than virtually anywhere else on the planet. And arguably, if you examine the results of that freedom, the idea of having choices, of making those choices based on what you as the individual think is best, rather than some centralized bureaucracy that tells you what is best. I think the benefits of individual liberty has resulted in the collective success of the Republic.
Absolutely. But let's talk about consequences.
Yeah.
The Great Reset, the marketing version of it, it sounds all nice and Star Trek-y. You saw the old Star Trek episodes where everybody was on the same mission, different backgrounds on the ship, making everything look nice. And yes, that is a dream of a lot of people in this world. We talked about how those ideals are being used to push a Great Reset, but the consequences are going to come forth. You're going to have to weaken some people. You're going to have to take down the economic level of nations like America and a lot of the West. I'm not sure if even China is going to go for that idea, but there are going to be a lot of consequences and buyer's remorse. So before we sign off, let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, let me frame, I'm a big fan of the Star Trek original series. With that said, it was full of utopian nonsense that Gene Roddenberry pushed his entire career. And I'm saying that as lovingly as I can, because the very concepts that Roddenberry pushed, he contradicted by having good writers come in, like City on the Edge of Forever was a great example of a story that talked about the dangers of Nazism, right? I mean, the whole central plot of that is the idea that Kurt had to go back and essentially allow someone to die. Otherwise, they would have allowed the Nazis to take over the planet. Geez, that doesn't sound like the idea of a single set of thoughts is a good idea. And Harlan Ellison wrote that great story. I think people ought to look into that. And the other big contradiction, I'm not sure if D.C. Fontana wrote it, but she wrote a lot of great episodes, was the Return of the Archons, where Kirk and company have to go on a planet where a society has become completely unified in thinking a certain way. A computer resulted in organizing the society and maintaining it in a certain order. Does that sound like something called the Great Reset? Let's all understand what's best, and let's all have a unified understanding of what's best.
If there's a lesson from history, it is that wherever socialism, communism has been tried, it's failed. And it's worth thinking about what's involved in the Great Reset from the aspect of very simple, well-known summaries of what's involved. Socialism, as Margaret Thatcher said, is great until it runs out of other people's money. The elites will not run out of money. It is the ordinary working people that will run out of money. It also then moves on to Reagan's concept, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right.
If you believe in that, then you probably you probably don't enjoy American society very much, and you may want a reset.
Well, Tim, that's the thing. There's 1,000 examples from history that we can look to determine what the world would be like if the Great Reset's stated objectives were achieved. And it's funny, I quoted an article at the beginning of this that said the Great Reset the world in the future looks like a place where you own nothing. And if that's what the Great Reset is purporting to celebrate, or if that's part of it at all, then that's exactly what it was like 200-300 years ago when everybody was under the reign of kings and monarchies. Nobody owned anything, land, homes, horses, it all belonged to the king. The king determined everyone's economic outcome, and everyone was poor and famished. Most people had no economic or political power. Owning things, personal property, is so intricately tied to liberty and the ability for people to organize and engage in politics and economics. It is critically important. And if one of the main objectives of the Great Reset, as stated, is to do away with things like personal property or a free market, then their opponent is also freedom and equality.
No, I think the feudal mercantilism is the goal. The idea is to return us to these large, centrally run, often focused on urban centers, areas where you all become serfs. You serve the master because the master knows better than you, and that is essentially is the cornerstone of what they want. Is this controlled society that will protect you, will take care of you, will tell you what's best, because you simply cannot be trusted to understand how you don't understand what's best for you.
The Morlocks and the Eloys once again.
Exactly.
Thank you for watching and listening to our London Center for Policy Research Great Reset Roundtable on Thought to Action. This is the first in a series of Great Reset Roundtables. If you'd like to help us produce future programs like this, future roundtables as well, plus enjoy sneak previews and exclusive content, please feel free to join our Patreon community, patreon.com/thought2action. That's patreon.com/thought2action. Also, learn more about the London Center at our website, londoncenter.org. What would also help us communicate this important information is if you'd help us by sharing this video with your friends, colleagues, and your social media network. Join in the conversation by commenting on the video. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel. Thank you again to our panelists, and on behalf of the London Center, thank you and have an excellent day. Welcome to part 2 of our Great Reset Forum from the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. The Great Reset, as touted by the World Economic Forum's Klaus Schwab, is not a new idea. The idea has been thrown around in different words in the past, most notably by former International Monetary Fund head Christine Lagarde, as a response to the 2008 financial crisis. The COVID pandemic, lockdowns, and economic downturns have emboldened supporters like the WEF leaders to try and push this idea once again. We at the London Center for Policy Research are going to discuss the Great Reset, what it's all about, and why it could cause severe damage to the entire world. With us, London Center for Policy Research President Tony Schaefer, Distinguished Fellow Brian Griffin, and Distinguished Fellow Pete O'Brien. Gentlemen, let's start. There are several different economic systems in the world. A Great Reset is called for by the World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab would require every nation to comply with theirs. How do proponents expect this to happen?
Thanks for that introduction, and I'm glad we're continuing to talk about this important topic because there really are more questions than answers. And that is the big question. How would this happen? How would these non-defined entities make these undefined decisions about what kind of economic system the entire world would live under? I'll read a quote from the World Economic Forum's website, and I encourage everybody to read their own words about the idea. They introduced the Great Reset with the following, quote, "There is an urgent need for global stakeholders to cooperate in simultaneously managing the direct consequences of the COVID-19 crisis." That's the setup and the introduction for the idea behind the Great Reset. Who are the global stakeholders? What does it mean to manage? I mean, who are the decision makers here? It's really not known, but the one thing that's very clear about the idea is that there are certainly going to be people at the top making decisions for everybody else. Restructuring economic systems from a free market to something different requires force. It's not voluntary participation if wealth is being redistributed and economic systems are being conformed to one universal one. And value-added trade is something that has caused humanity to benefit and prosper for the last couple hundred years, since it's really been something that's been introduced globally and enshrined in the systems of government that many citizens enjoy. So if we take value-added trade off the table, or if we substitute it with something else, then it would have to be something done by force. And I think there's probably some intentionality in the vagueness of this idea.
Marx once said religion is the opioid of the people. I think he was completely wrong. The opioid of the people is this idea that centralized control and socialism is going to create a panacea. It won't. One of the notable features of all of this is not having features. One of the things I've most been troubled by is the lack of investment at the personal level in the system. That is to say that in the system, you don't own anything. You simply use things. It becomes essentially communal property. You go to Amazon, you don't get to buy a song, you get to use a song for the time you have it. You don't actually own an apartment. You get to use an apartment as long as you need to. The idea is, you get more choices. The opposite is correct. And I think this idea of control by a government of the economy is going to be very dangerous. So not only do you have the individuals not invested in it, then that kills all creativity, that kills all incentives to do things. It essentially creates conditions for failure. One of the little known stories is Plymouth Rock. When the first pilgrims came over, they implemented a society that everybody was equal. Everything is communally owned. It almost failed. People almost died by the fact that nobody was invested. Only when they reintroduced the concepts of capitalism, of, hey, that's your farm, go do something with it. And I'm going to help you, if you do it, I'm going to give you X. I'm going to, essentially create conditions for people to be invested. That's one danger. You lose that. And secondly, who trusts governments? Who would trust a world government completely free of any real oversight to tell you what you can and cannot do, or what you can and cannot own, or better yet, you don't own anything. We own it, and you get to borrow it. Oh, but if you do something we don't like, we're going to make your life hell. So it's a very dangerous concept without any really clear answers. And again, I would just say this is the opioid of the people. This is that thing that they try to keep. Oh, it's going to be better, but they don't know how. And arguably, based on the evidence of the past, it would be much worse.
Oh, what makes it even worse as you think about this. Nobody owns anything. Everybody
Right.
borrows everything. And they're using, ironically, the pandemic to create this sort of thing, gentlemen.
Oh, yeah.
However, think about this. If you're going to be not owning an apartment, you kind of switch out with everybody else and not own anything. Everybody's going to be touching these things here and there. Isn't this the kind of thing they try to prevent by locking us down beforehand? I could see a worse pandemic, a lot of germs, and this could be much worse medically. I don't even know what they're thinking sometimes when it comes to something like this, though. Pete?
It all comes down to how many people are part of the decision-making process in society. And one of the great things about, the American model is that the decision-making process it's got multiple levels. You've got citizen input in our republic. We also have the federal system, with states and local governments. So the more decision makers generally in society, the better. This idea tries to reduce the number of decision makers, the managers that are going to dictate a new level of economics. And by the way, the World Economic Forum is not something that anybody can participate in. It's an invite-only club, and there's certainly no public comment in the discussion about the Great Reset. So perhaps that's best analogous to the idea that this is reducing the number of people that are going to be involved in making decisions about everybody's life, which is bad.
And if I can jump in,
here. A couple of things too. You know, they talk about in the terms are used, the term of the phrase is used repeatedly in a number of different documents I've read. Is, you know, that to essentially blend out the differences between various economic systems. And part of me immediately recoils. There's only one economic system. There's only one set of economic laws. The economies work in a given way. Money works in a given way. Markets work in a given way. There are very clear rules. What happens is that governments step in and attempt to manipulate the markets. That's why you develop the so-called economic systems. What they really are, they're government systems to control essentially a universal process, which is called market economy. And the only thing that you can say is to the benefit of that concept of a government stepping in is there are limited reasons why those are acceptable actions for defined periods of time. If a country is acting improperly, very improperly, then there is perhaps a reason why a government or a certain number of governments would step in and raise tariffs or raise certain economic barriers against that country to try and control them. But they're not doing it for economics. They're not doing it for an economic reason. They're doing it for a political reason. And so it's important to understand that markets function the way markets do. That being said, if I set up a world bureaucracy, the world bureaucracy, in the end, just like every government, the world bureaucracy will pick winners.
Yep.
And when they do that, what happens is you get, roll the clock back, you get trusts and monopolies. There's a reason why we had a headbanging session 100 years ago in this country about trusts and monopolies, because government had gotten in bed with certain key individuals and they set up organizations, these very large, vertically and horizontally integrated corporations that controlled whole sectors of the economy. Well, the people don't benefit from that, but that's what you're going to get if you have a global economy. You're not going to get everybody gets free access to the market. You're going to, they very specifically have said they've got to learn how to control these things. So they're going to control access to the market. Just because you have a better mousetrap, no one's going to care, because there's some trillionaire down the corner who has a mousetrap already that he's marketing. Your competition, and you have no say, you'll be taken out of the problem. So if we're going to start looking at this thing and from essentially a true economic perspective, the economics are completely not on their side. The economics of centralized control don't work. If you want a good example of centralized economics, go look at the Soviet Union. It was swell. And what they're trying to do here is say, no, we can make it better, trust us. But the only thing that really happens is you wind up with a bunch of oligarchs who are fabulously wealthy and fabulously powerful, and the rest of us are all in the back of the bus.
Well, these brilliant fellows over in the World Economic Forum think they have an idea to handle this. These resetters advocate for something called a cashless digital society. It's a concept seen in science fiction movies, books, and television shows. I enjoyed watching it on Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. Remember the credits and everything else, that little bat thing, the club thing, they'd stick in some kind of computer. But looking at recent world history, this could also be subject to major cybersecurity issues, right?
Let's define this for what it is. The issue of cyber is at the forefront of everybody's mind. Everybody says Bitcoin is a place to be. And I'm skeptical, because anything digital, I think, can be damaged or otherwise modified. The idea that you trust the internet with your money is a bit of a stretch. Plus, who controls the internet? I would argue, there's a lot of danger with people diverting or allowing their real wealth to be essentially digitized. I've got real issues with that. So that's something I think for another day we should go through. But Chris, the big point of currency is something that we need to examine. There are a lot of folks in the United States right now who are basically going to a barter system because they don't even trust our normal currency system. A lot of folks have recognized the ability to create markets, self-organizing markets, to basically hey, I have raw milk. I want a leather chair. Why don't I give you raw milk for a month and you make a chair? By the way, that cuts the government out altogether, cuts out any taxation. And this is all being done under the radar. So if you go to a global paperless, non-descriptive currency, you're going to see a lot more of this. People just won't participate, and the governments are going to be. It's going to be hard for governments to detect this. So I think that's something that we need to look at as a realistic issue. And I don't believe it's practical. Look at the issue of currency and what happened with the euro. England made a very wise choice to never give up its pound, and I think they were very smart in doing that, because the euro did not create a parity for all those nations. It actually victimized the nations which have lower incomes. Greece and Portugal suffered greatly at the hands of the euro, not having their own currency, because by the euro becoming very expensive, everything became more expensive to them. So that's the same thing we have to recognize here, that this idea of one size fits all, this, again, a panacea, is just that. It's not they've never done the actual detailed and hard research to understand vulnerabilities, the likely failures of economics within the larger construct, and the idea that if it gets to the point of where people don't participate, you lose the ability to tax. And boy, everything in Europe is VAT, is value-added tax. And a lot of people like me believe the taxation should be minimal, based on simple requirements of the government, not something the governments continue to expand. And this would give that potential. So.
And that's a great point, Tony, is that if you set up a World Economic Control Organization of some sort, the first thing that they will want as a real authority is the authority to tax. So you're going to have another tier of taxation. You're going to have a global tax. Everybody wants to wrap their head around that for just a second and think about how horrible that would be, apart from anything else. But the issue of a paperless currency, there's obviously the simple issue of personal freedom. You are tied to a credit card. The credit card can be tracked. If someone doesn't want you moving, all of a sudden you can't purchase gas. That kind of thing. But even before you get there, the simple economics of this, we've already seen the world's economies inflate like a gas balloon over the last 50 years as everybody has moved away from hard currencies. There are no hard currencies, no currencies that are backed by gold reserves or silver reserves or anything else on the planet today. They're not. Everybody has what is known as a fiat currency, a currency that is simply a result of orders from the state to print paper currency, to print bonds, T-notes, federal treasury notes, and cash. And that works as long as it works. That sounds silly, but as long as you can keep, if you will, the plate spinning on the end of the stick and everything is balanced, it works. At a certain point, one might argue that eventually they'll lose control of the plate. And at that point, you have a huge amount of currency floating around. And the question becomes, what is it really worth? And then you get back to, as Tony just said, you get back to the issue of barter. Take a look, too, at, as an example, the Federal Reserve, as I use it as a subset of the model of what would be a global currency reserve. They would be controlling, this organization would be controlling currency just like the Fed. The Fed is a one-trick pony. The Fed's answer is they either pull or push on currency values and interest rates. That's what they do. And in the last, I think it's 30 years, we've gone from $1.3 trillion in currency to, in the last like 8 years, it's increased to $7 trillion in currency as the Fed struggles to maintain control of this very fine balanced thing called the monetary policy, our monetary theory around our economy. And so far, they've kept inflation at about 2% so far. Does anybody think they're going to be able to control that for the rest of all time? Don't know. But the first thing you should watch for is wage and price controls. That's what they'll throw at the system to try and stop it.
And I mean, what would this global Fed look like? Who would it be accountable to? I mean, again, very light on the details here about this Great Reset idea. And I think it would be a long shot that this global federal kind of Fed equivalent would be accountable to anybody. There's a lot of the World Economic Forum's description of this idea has to do with resetting the world's economies and restructuring the world's wealth based on some idea of equity or equality. Well, who's defining that, right? And does anybody have any participation in that definition? Every one of these ideas requires fewer decisions to be held by people, more power consolidated at the top, and governments get it wrong. The Fed gets it wrong. There are countries that have currencies that mistreat the currencies and cause global economic issues. If we put all of this, we bank all of this in one centralized entity and amass all of this power and all of this decision-making capability in one centralized entity, then we better hope that they are the smartest, most well-equipped group of people ever, because we will
most
have
moral.
and most moral, exactly, because we will have no recourse. Again, something like the Great Reset is not going to be something that allows for voluntary opting in and opting out. It will be a forced restructuring of economic systems, and all of our recourse, all of our decision-making capabilities, our individual sovereignty will be taken.
And you mentioned that we have to trust these people. You're trusting these people to do another thing. They have to make a universal cashless or whatever currency they want to pull off. This idea would also require them greatly weakening the stronger countries' currencies like the pound and the dollar, as well as instantly propping up the extremely weak economies like those in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Incidentally, I have a $1 million bill sitting on my shelf from Zimbabwe, which would get me a half a loaf of bread. Pretty good. But I can say I'm a millionaire there. That's okay.
Awesome.
But what would such a move, though, do to the overall economies, inflation, and employment situations in nations in both the highest and lowest echelons of the currency strength scale?
That's one of those mystery questions that is going to be dependent upon exactly. Imagine that they set up this forum and they set up this control mechanism, and they're now controlling this one global economy through their monetary and fiscal policies. Obviously there would have to be some sort of transition. How they make that transition is going to be very painful or very, very, very painful to the different countries. Some countries there are a few small countries which would probably come out feeling pretty good because they were bankrupt before, now they're not. But there's a whole host of issues here that are going to be very interesting, because unless the angels are all present dancing on the heads of pins, somebody's wealth is going to be redefined down. And most likely to do that, if you're really going to do that, you would have to take the stronger currencies and define them down, and the weaker currencies essentially define their economies up. So if you're very wealthy, you're going to have to step down. If you're not as wealthy, you're going to have to step up in order to provide this mysterious thing called equity. Well, that means that if you have a great deal of wealth, let's say that it's sort of old-fashioned wealth. Let's say you own a family farm. And the family farm is, you've got, I remember a friend of mine years ago in the Navy, his family owned 10,000 acres of corn and bean out in Missouri. They didn't have 2 dimes to rub together. They worked their backsides off, but they had this magnificent farm. And they make ends meet because they grow grain and they sell it, and they stay just ahead of the debt monster. An organization like that, a family like that, when all of a sudden everything is defined down, unless it's timed perfectly, everything happens at the exact same moment, and it can't. They're all of a sudden going to wind up with more debt than wealth coming in, than money coming in, as things are redefined. And they're going to, people like that would lose their farm. That's the kind of uneven snowball that you're going to get run over by as they pursue equity.
You could only equalize down, right? You can only equalize by taking things away from people because it's not a value-added system. And that's the beauty of the free market. Any trade that happens in the free market is made by voluntary participation where both sides are gaining value from participating in the trade. Redistributing things, it's a zero-sum game.
Well, I think
Perfectly
it's one of the
said.
keys that the other side fails to explain when they go through this, the World Economic Forum and socialism in general. The idea of equality. Well, to your point, Brian, and what you said, Pete, it's the people presume, the people, the masses, oh, I'm going to get something more. And that's not necessarily true. That means that those who have the most will technically lose stuff, and those in the middle will lose stuff because all it does is reduce everything. It doesn't create anything. And this is where I think, going back to the Soviet system, that was apparent, that the equality was misery. What they basically create is misery. Everybody gets equally miserable. You can't find things, you can't buy things, and only those in charge, in this case, we don't know who's really in charge, that's not really clear, are the ones who benefit. They're the ones, the people who control it are actually the beneficiaries. And this is, I think, what they're seeking to do. I would argue that this is an elitist view of the world where the haves, they are the haves, will give us equal shares of whatever is left of what they don't want. And it's a very dangerous concept.
And
I
which
can
is
jump in. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and it's no way equal. I mean, the free market is the great equalizer, and the last 200 years have shown us that. We've gone from living in caste systems and monarchies where you've got, the basic very poor serfdom versus the elite, and there's never any cross between the two parts of society, to a free market-based world where anybody can contribute. They can contribute based upon their own, desire, and that contribution is one that it doesn't require the permission or decisions of somebody else. That is the great equalizer. If a side cares about equity or equality, then it would be the side that's pushing for more decision-making power to more people or a free and fair market.
And if I can jump into that, because that issue of real equality, one of the things people don't like to talk about, but the thing you need to have when you're talking about equality is people have to have the opportunity to fail.
Yep.
And if they didn't fail, if you didn't let things fail, we would still have Blockbuster video stores, right? No one would be using them, and they would be sitting there occupied by thousands and thousands and thousands of videotapes unwatched from one end of the week to the other, but they would have employees who were totally unproductive, but we would not let Blockbuster fail. Blockbuster had to fail because that was what happened. The technology came along, Blockbuster went away. If you have a centrally controlled economy, the centrally controlled economy won't let companies fail. And in fact, you'll get one of these wonderful situations you saw in the Soviet Union in writ small, was there were particular types of companies in which there was one in every Soviet Socialist Republic. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't even effective. A lot of them made junk, but they didn't want them to go out of business. So these things stayed in existence for years and years and years after there was any value in them at all. But the system insisted that they stay in place. You're going to get the exact same thing with the global economy. You're going to get the central economy saying, well, Venezuela needs their own car company. No, they don't.
Yeah.
But they're going to keep them in place anyway. And so if you insist upon equity, some ill-defined equity at the outcome, and you refuse to let things fail in the process of getting there, you're going to very quickly wind up with a messed up economy.
This is our Thought to Action Great Reset Roundtable Part 2. This is a full series. You're going to be seeing some more of these in the future. If you'd like to help us produce more content like this and enjoy exclusive programming that we make just for our Patreon community, join our Patreon community. That's patreon.com/thought to action. That's patreon.com/thought to action. check out what we're doing at the London Center at londoncenter.org. Let's continue this on, as we will have more in this series. Going back to Klaus Schwab's infamous quote, gentlemen, he says, every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. But in my experience, and believe me, if you're going to try to get some people who are very powerful, they want their money and likely aren't going to give up that money without a piece of the power in return. What kind of deals would need to be made with these people?
Chris, I just a very quick summary of what deal would have to be made. Look at Hitler's Germany, late 1930s. That's the kind of deals where essentially a government controls what large businesses do. Crony capitalism. That's what it would have to be done.
Yeah, I would just add, you're going to wind up with a couple of companies in every industry. You're going to wind up with, Krupp and IG Farben and Siemens.
Exactly.
And there will be no competition. It will be, Tony will have 55% of the market. I have 45% of the market. And if someone comes along with a better idea, he gets squished.
Yeah.
Period.
I highly recommend people. Yeah, I highly recommend people study that period. Not just look at the economics of that period. This is what he's talking about.
Well, and the other casualty is innovation, right? Because if there's no competition, then why would there be any incentive to do anything better or create a better product? And one of the reasons that we've got a lot of the technology and medicine and advances that we enjoy today is thanks to the free market system of people being able to be rewarded for doing things better than others. That's why I think America was able to produce so many COVID vaccines so quickly, because there was a competition to be first and to do it right. That's just one example of thousands of things that everybody takes for granted that will be a casualty of a forced top-down economic system.
The laptop computer. There was no call for a laptop computer in 1970.
Sure. Mobile phone. You name it.
Mobile phone with cameras. Yeah.
Or even Zoom, for that matter.
Working from home.
President Joe Biden has expressed his support for the Great Reset in the past. We cannot deny that our national debt is overwhelming and has skyrocketed at an enormous pace since 2009. What role might our financial situation play as an excuse to assimilate into the Davos dream? And alternatively, how can America fight back on the economic front?
Boy, well, I recommend anybody who wants to see useless spending that has burdened every citizen in the United States with debt, look at this $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. It's atrocious. And the idea that every citizen, I did not get permission for my name to be added to supporting this bill, but each of us have been saddled, depending on who you talk to, between $5,000 and $10,000 per person. This is all debt being pushed off into the future. I think it's dangerous. I think it's something that that may well justify others, international organizations, saying, "Well, you owe us all this money. You now have to be subordinated to us." I think it's a very dangerous thing.
One of the items they routinely talk about in the Great Reset is a universal income. That everybody is going to get, I'll pull a number out of the air, $1,000 a month, whatever. The problem is that there's been this kind of willy-nilly numbers in the air going on for quite some time. And if you start looking at the various entitlement programs, both in the United States and elsewhere, assume the United States is about 30% of the global problem. That's probably a little bit generous, but let's just say it's 30%. A Harvard economist just last 12 months put together a study. He estimated that by the end of 2019, he put together all of the entitlement programs, public and private, the pension funds, everything of the U.S. government and of any place inside the U.S. government, corporate funding, corporate debt, et cetera. He came up with $405 trillion in debt in the United States. Now, let's just say that's 30% of the world, okay? That puts total global debt at over $250 billion. Over $1 quadrillion.
Right.
Okay, quadrillion. Let that number roll around in your tongue for a little while. $1 quadrillion. and it's growing. And the idea that we're going to throw on top of this, for example, something like universal basic income and a whole host of government infrastructure programs, global infrastructure programs. What we're creating here is an even larger house of cards, and when it comes down, it is not going to be pretty.
Thank you for joining us for this second installment of our Thought to Action Great Reset Roundtable. We'll be producing more of these. Please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel on YouTube and on Rumble so you do not miss these discussions and our other videos in the future. If you'd like to keep up with us, check us out on our website, londoncenter.org. The Great Reset Roundtable and Thought to Action are brought to you by the London Center for Policy Research. If you'd like to catch these before anybody else, sneak preview them, and enjoy exclusive content, please become part of our Patreon community. Patreon.com/thought-to-action. That's patreon.com/thought-to-action. Thanks again to our panelists, and thank you for being with us. Welcome to our third installment of the London Center for Policy Research's Thought to Action program's Great Reset Roundtable. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. This is where members of the London Center talk about the Great Reset as initiated and conceived by Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. Find out more about what we're doing at the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Patreon channel, and we have a lot of things going on. If you're with us on Patreon, you can also get some of these programs before everybody else can. We sneak preview those on our Patreon channel. You can also watch our very intense and very informative Ask Us Anything sessions, which are exclusive to our Patreon patrons. We keep hearing Joe Biden talk about his Build Back Better plan. Build Back Better was what he talked about all throughout his campaign. He talks about it now when he talks about his infrastructure plan. It's Build Back Better. We need to build back better. He says it all the time. But is Build Back Better really a gate opening us to a great reset or something close to that? Our panel is going to discuss that today. With us is London Center for Policy Research President Tony Schaefer, Brian Griffin, Distinguished Fellow, and Pete O'Brien, Distinguished Fellow. Gentlemen, let's start. It's no secret the World Economic Forum head Klaus Schwab and his organization's most vocal leaders advocate a great reset and using the pandemic as an excuse. This would, however, require not the strengthening of the third world nations, but the weakening of the more economically sound ones, sort of breaking them, if you will. Shutting down Western economies was a big step, but note that nations which did not stay in the lockdown for as long, like China, seemed to find a way to strengthen. President Biden loves to repeat that Build Back Better campaign slogan when trying to garner support for his arguably radical policies. The big infrastructure bill not only ignores protecting our power grid from a tax or a CME event, which we talked about on several programs, but it also throws massive amounts of money into pork and social policy having nothing to do with infrastructure, weakening the economy and national defense at the same time. So let's talk about that first. Tony?
Yeah, let me just open by saying that looking at the World Economic Forum and Dr. Klaus Schwab, just a historic note, I tend to believe that we need to be careful of any German who has a vision of social purity and economic control based on their own belief of utopia. Just saying, I think we've been down that path before. It didn't go very well, as I recall. And the parallels between what he's proposing, and I'm being a bit humorous in my presentation, but I'm completely serious. One of the reasons that Nazi Germany, failed to win World War II was its over-reliance on the nationalization of resources. From 1936 on, I'm going somewhere with this, trust me. From 1936 on, essentially all means of production, to include energy at the spectrum of whatever the state decided was important for the state, became controlled by the state. So, for instance, coal production, one of the things that Germany had massive amounts of, had no resource shortage of, was coal. But the moment the government took it over, there were shortages. Where have we heard this before? Hitler decided that the state would determine what the resource should go for and go to. Money meant nothing after 1936 regarding these sorts of things. So that's the danger of what Klaus Schwab is proposing here, essentially that there's going to be some level of state control, of state dispensation and disposition of all of these resources. And we saw in Argentina, we saw in Venezuela, we've seen in other places, the moment the government comes in and removes the free market, the government cannot anticipate, react, or manage the massive amounts of social and commercial need for resources. It's just not possible. Germany set up in the 30s 4-year plans that were supposed to manage this. It parallels what the Soviets did. It's all socialism. Social republics, Russia, not Nazis, National Socialism. The idea here is that they're taking and socializing means of production, means of dispensation and disposition. It doesn't work. And all we're seeing here, all we're talking about here, and I challenge the distinguished fellows, since I'm not distinguished, to tell me I'm wrong here. But I think this is all about trying to retool, repackage, rebrand the socialist policies that failed in Nazi Germany, that failed in the Soviet Union, that failed in Venezuela, but somehow believing that we are smarter this time. We, the economic forum, are smarter, and we'll get it right. So that's kind of my going in position. Tell me I'm wrong.
If I could jump in, 2 thoughts. Three thoughts. First off, you're not wrong. But the second thought is, it's of note, people like to say that fascism is somehow on the right end of the spectrum. Fascism is merely a slightly different name for socialism, in which there is both socialism and an emphasis on a national identity. But in a fascist state, the state, as you just said, Tony, the government dictates what the market, but no longer really a market, is going to do. And if you look at Germany, the rich families, the folks at the top at Krupp and IG Farben and Siemens, et cetera, they made a great deal of money. They did exactly what the Nazi government wanted them to do, and they made a great deal of money in doing it. But there was no free marketplace. And I would add this third thought in. If people want to think that somehow, well, it's different today, and we could in fact figure out what each sector of the economy needs to do and what they need to manufacture, and we should have some sort of centralized control, and that somehow you can do this for a population of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. I would challenge you to just do this one thing. Take out a piece of paper. You are sitting there listening to this. Take out a piece of paper, and today write down everything you are going to need for the next 4 years, and plan how to buy that, when to buy it, where to buy it, etc. And then do it for everybody else on your street. Right. Just your street. Not asking you to do it for the whole country, just for the 20 or 30 houses on your street. Figure out what they're going to need for the next 5 years, and drop a list. That is what central planning claims to be able to do for a country, in our case, of 331 million people. It is patently absurd, and has never been demonstrated to work. And the harder people try, the worse it gets. And if you point to China and say, well, it's working in China, you need to take a hard look at what is and what is not working in China, and the people who are being put upon, right? Because it's not really working in China.
And let's not forget the most important lesson that came from Nazi Germany, which is as government gets bigger, their economic policies did not work, but as government gets bigger and decision making becomes removed from the hands of the people and moves into the hand of some type of centralized power, any type of centralized power, then dialogue, discussion, and ideas shrink. Right. And that means that bad ideas can flourish. And that means that somebody somewhere can have an idea, a horrible idea like racial superiority, and run with it. And then how do people challenge that? Well, if they don't have the means to participate in the market, if they no longer have liquid assets, if they no longer have the ability to speak out, then that idea can take over that society. And that's what's happened every single time that government has gotten big enough and centralized enough to produce something like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Mao Zedong's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia. Bad ideas catch on because the marketplace of ideas has shrunk, and those bad ideas can't be challenged. And then we have horrible things that come from it. So thank God Hitler failed. And may we never put ourselves in a situation where that much power is consolidated at the top ever again.
But Brian, to that point, that's what they want. They want essentially centralized control distributed to a handful of elites, which then can tell us, well, you can rent things from Amazon, you can't own it. The idea is that everything becomes essentially not owned, which means the state or whatever the government entity owned. And that's what you're talking about here, right? I mean,
Right.
We're talking about essentially removal of all these decisions from us.
Right? And they're setting themselves up for failure. And they're absolutely kidding themselves if they don't think that setting the stage for that much centralized power won't allow for, if not by them, then the next person to come along to take those reins of power won't allow them to undertake some horrible ideology and push it on people.
And if I could just jump in there too, is one of the things you need to watch here, that every time you've had one of these states start to develop, there's always a few folks right at the very beginning who at least sound benign. But when a crisis develops, either they change their, if you will, change their spots, or someone else emerges. The classic strongman emerges,
Right.
who fixes the problems. And they fix the problem, the process of fixing the problems in a state. And you can go back and take a look at this. Start in ancient Rome, start in ancient Persia, look at Cyrus the Great, look at Diocletian, come forward into the Middle Ages, come forward to the current age. The strong man does this by being a strong man. He doesn't debate. He doesn't ask for new ideas. He tells you what the answer is. Sometimes if you happen to be properly positioned, his telling you what the answer is benefits you. But most of the people are not aided by this anymore, except that the crisis ends. The crisis ends, and now the state has more power. So
Well, and this relates to the overall trend regarding woke. The idea here is to use that division of race, color, of creed as a tool to reorganize under this ideal, Pete, if you will, that the state knows better. We will be the ones who decide equity and fairness. And Brian, this goes back to your point regarding the economic control. It seems to me to your point, and boy, I could say a lot and get in trouble here. The utopian ideas that were put forth of social purity link directly into how much benefit you gain from the government. Is that a correct assessment?
Is that for me?
Yeah, for you, Brian.
You're gonna have to do that point again, Tony. Let me
so-
jump off again. Sorry.
All right,
Okay,
so let
take
me
two here, take
restate
two,
this. So
yeah.
what Pete is saying regarding the overall underlying ideas that you have to have a certain level of wokeness to be able to understand and use this Build Back Better concept. You're using essentially the wokeism, the idea that everybody's racist and the government is the only one that can determine fairness. We, the government, have to be the ones who step in and tell you that you're a racist and we'll figure out how to fix it. That then, Brian, links into the economic piece you were mentioning regarding how they control this for purposes of telling you the more pure you are of the government's interpretation of social equity and utopian concepts, the more you benefit economically. If you don't go along, you're not part of the economic picture. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, that's right, because the idea behind wokeism is that values must be directed to people from the top down. And the problem is that government doesn't have any internal innate values, and government is designed to grow itself and sustain itself and consolidate more power, which means that its values will be whatever it can say or do to get more power. So if that's who's deciding what values are, and then the economic means to push back against that is taken from people. Like I said, the ability to organize, to politicize, to voice opposition, if that's taken from people so that value system won't be challenged, then we're left with only one option. And I think the woke crowd is getting it wrong. I think that their focus that they have on race and on characteristics that are not based on merit, that are not based on choice, but that are based on, demographics that you're born with, to focus on that and to organize society by that and to force society to compete based on those things, those are wrong. Fortunately, I can still speak out against that. Fortunately, the four of us can be here on this YouTube channel speaking about those things, but if the economic means to do so were taken from us, then what challenges an idea like that? And what challenges any idea, any bad idea, from allowing it to flourish?
And that's a great point. If you kind of roll back and start looking at the specifics of some of the things that the current administration is looking at, it speaks right to what you're saying, Brian. One of the small items in a $2 trillion bill, because it's only $8 or $9 or $10 billion a year, is that the plan adds 87,000 IRS agents to the IRS, and in the bill gives them the authority. One wonders as to the constitutionality of this, but gives them the authority essentially to go through all your bank accounts without any predicate cause. They can just start searching your bank accounts and looking for things that they consider to be aberrations, and then essentially run you down on those oddities. So you have essentially the government asking for both the authority and the personnel to spend time routing around in everybody's bank account. Now they'll claim they're going to go after the rich people. Well, if you're Bill Gates, you already have your money hidden. You don't have your money in bank accounts. It's not there. It's not visible in a bank account. And so,
well, the other thing about Pete, the rich are going to fight you. They have the reason and means and resources to fight you. They're going to go after people they know can't fight, have no recourse. But
the four of us have no real ability to challenge the IRS in court over any extended period of time.
Or the Justice Department, I might add, which we've seen politicized.
And keep in mind, the political class can, do a legal form of, let's say, curveball insider trading. So they'll know what's going on ahead of time as well.
Absolutely. They'll be able to carve out a niche for themselves.
As we know, it's far better to be awake than woke. But let's keep in mind, an important component is the how. How do we build back better? What do we build back better from? You can't do that. You can't build back from a booming economy. You can't build back from solid policy, and you can't build back from better defense. What you need to do is do something, for lack of a better term, great, but I'll say enormous. How about that? The way to do this is to break something. How about the supply chain? That's what happened. The COVID panic provided a perfect cover. There were shutdowns by the masses all over Western society. Many states and European nations were under complete lockdown multiple times. And in America, the blue-led states as well, as mentioned before, massive. This is even after 15 days to flatten the curve was over. Shutdowns kept producers from putting together food, mining, lumber, steel, aluminum, computer chips, creating shortages and skyrocketing prices. This breaks the supply chain altogether, and we have these shortages, high prices, huge inflation, increasing demand, and poorer people, opening desperation required for a great reset compliance in theory, and a sort of build back better guise.
I got something to say about that. I mean, look, here's the pattern that we saw over the last couple of years. The government shuts everything down. The government forces business not to be open. The government forces people to restrict the amount of not only money that they have, the amount of money that they can make. And the government comes in with a $1.9 trillion plan to give that money back to people and then claim themselves as the hero, right? But basically what happened is the government is taking credit for saving people from itself, from the government. Classic pattern of authoritarianism, unfortunately. It's to cause the means of the greatest destruction on people, or withhold, the ability for people to thrive and make decisions and make money and have access to the free market, and then make itself be the hero, the savior. And unfortunately, we see that too often around the world these days, where people are kept basically in positions of oppression so that the government can be the only source of people's ability to get their basic needs met. That's why the free market is such a powerful alternative to government, and that's why government fears and wants to stifle the free market, because it's in direct competition. They're in direct competition with one another, and the government hates anything or anybody that competes with its ability to be the greatest power.
And COVID was a perfect cover for that.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Pete?
Well, I would add on top of what Brian just said too, was that the creation of a series of programs that have now gone forward to if you will, economically and physically restrict Americans. 2 years ago, we were a net exporter of energy. We're back to being a net importer, purely based upon policy decisions. And there's plenty of energy in this country. There's enough energy in this country to last for several centuries as a net exporter of energy. There is a pile of energy in this country in the form of coal, natural gas, oil, and of course, uranium. And if you want really clean electricity, you don't build farms with solar panels that leach heavy metals into the soil. You build nuclear reactors. But let's not go there right now.
Right.
But meanwhile, we have the government saying that we want more electric cars. They're putting up barriers to people. In the future, there'll be barriers to people buying gasoline engine powered cars, restricting mobility of people, particularly the people in the bottom half of the economy. Meanwhile, they're raising the price of fuel, further restricting the people in the bottom half of the economy who need to be able to move.
Right.
And so you have this, they attack things from a number of different angles at the same time, making this thing increasingly, if you will, an octopus that's holding on to the average American. And the only way to go back to it is to, as Brian so accurately says here, is to go back to a market-based economy.
Well, I like to pick up on that point, Pete, of what you guys said. Look, one of the things that was clear from the COVID issue, from the 2 weeks to depress the curve to where we're at now, is that fear was used essentially as a tool to replace the free market with government. Government knew better, therefore we're going to tell you what you need to do and not do. And now President Biden is offering your freedom back if you get the shot. We're going to give you back your freedom. And so, first off, I've gone on with my life pretty much normal. I travel, I do my own thing. I've never accepted that, but it's very clear that they've used fear as a tool to essentially separate the individual from the free market and make them more dependent on the government. And one of no greater example was this whole, even Trump fell for it, this whole idea of these checks back from the IRS. We're going to give you $1,400. Yeah, but you just had me pay $25,000 for taxes.
Exactly.
How is that supposed to help me? I mean, I'm paying you for the privilege of you giving back my money. And again, both sides did this, because even the conservatives seems to not understand, at least those in power, is like, this isn't helping. The best thing you could do is diminish, if not eliminate, taxation so that people can maintain what they have and the government can go off and do its own thing. Because Brian, I think you made this point, all production comes from the private sector. The government does absolutely nothing to produce anything. It's a leech. So, and we've seen those who are most enlightened to reopen the economy rapidly. Texas, I was in Texas recently, things are popping, and Florida. And those states more readily recognize that the science says you need to get people out, and masks don't work for the most part. I mean, if in very limited circumstance. And oh, by the way, for most demographics, a 99% recovery rate, in case you get it. So the other side, the progressives have used the science, or I should say they've denied the science for purposes of trying to maintain the fear. That fear is then used to separate individuals from the free market and make them swag over and trust the government. And boy, I don't know how at this point people don't understand what a fraud the federal government, CDC, has been regarding the science behind this. And now, it's breaking. Something I said a year ago. Looks like the Wuhan lab had a hand in allowing a weaponized version of the virus to leak out. Oh, that
and
couldn't say that
Beijing had a
year ago.
hand in
Now
covering
it's-
it up and letting the world get infected,
Right. The thing is,
causing
though,
5 million deaths.
the
Yeah.
thing is, we can't gloss over the idea that the stimulus checks are being pushed out again, which in a way was a good thing and not a good thing. If you shut the supply chain down, you shut down all sorts of businesses, where's that money coming from? You have to keep printing it. Keep
Yep.
printing it, weaken the dollar, which is basically the world's standard currency. And again, the only way to get to a great reset or readjust the world's, let's say, future globalist economy in the Davos dream is to weaken the strong nations and weaken the strongest currencies. And America has been playing ball with this for a long time. That's what Build Back Better does. Brian?
Well, I just think that the biggest lesson that came out of all of this is that our government is way too big. We've had two perfect examples so far. So Pete talked about how the government can basically manipulate policy to reduce our energy independence, not because of a lack of access to natural resources, but simply out of the government's vision for what society should be. Harms the American people, but helps achieve their political vision for society. Number two, the government claimed to or tried to set itself up to be the sole dictator and source of science, basically. It sounds simple and silly, but that's the way that they've set themselves up. If the CDC doesn't say it, then it can't be science, and there's no ability for the private sector to test and confirm or deny or add empirical data to the decision-making process. The government is the sole arbiter of what is scientific and what isn't. And then I'll give example number three, the labor market. Sheerly through government policy, we have an employment rate somewhere above 6%, and we have 8.1 million people out of the job market. How does that make any sense? How do those numbers make sense in the same country at the same time? Because the policy, the powerful use of incentives in this infrastructure bill and otherwise, where unemployment is basically more incentivized than working, has, through government dictates, caused us to have a unemployment rate and plenty of people who can take the jobs who don't want it. So again, this is reshaping society through economic policy in the vision of what people at the top think it should be, no matter what's good for people, no matter what's good for the economy, but solely based on a political agenda. That's incredibly dangerous. And by the way, all of these things have been done through unelected bureaucratic arms of our executive branch, which now has an employment figure in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. When are we going to realize that this government is way too big and that it's too easy to reshape American society based on your political agenda right at the top?
And if I can just add in, give a few more numbers here. How much money have they been printing? As Brian was saying, they're printing money. In January of 2008, just before the 2008 bubble burst, that year before, there was about $900 billion in circulation. As of last September, there was about $4.5 trillion in circulation. And now there's about $5.5 trillion in circulation. So we increased the money supply between 2008 and 2020. We increased the money supply more than 300%. And then in the last 6-7 months, we've increased it another, on top of that 400%, 300% rather, we've increased it another 25%. We've increased it $1 trillion in the last 7 months. And we're still printing money. And by the way, we're told by the experts at the Fed that they have this under control, that there will not be any inflation. If you believe that, call me. I have a great deal of it.
Opening the nation's borders is a key component to Schwab's Great Reset, which calls for all of the European and Western civilization-dominated nations to open up those borders and take in as many immigrants from the third world as possible. Couple that with leftist policies in place in major cities like sanctuaries and everything else like that, and an overwhelming attitude of anti-assimilation that comes with it, you've destroyed a nation's unity. And that opens it up for globalism and a great reset. Joe Biden's immigration policies are arguably in direct compliance with Klaus Schwab's suggestion in that realm.
two points just to open up the conversation. One of the greatly ironic and often not discussed facts is a guy named President Reagan turned California blue. And he did that by the granting of amnesty. First time and only time the president's ever granted amnesty to individuals here illegally. And the theory, the bargain was he was going to get a closed border. He didn't. And we've seen essentially, I think he or someone else said, that which you subsidize, you're going to get more of. So without following his own policy, he did something that essentially turned, that massive state into a blue utopia, because it's different than most other states, and it's going to stay that way apparently. So I think that's the first lesson. The moment you grant amnesty, you're going to essentially make sure that you create a permanent underclass that'll assure continued voting of the left. Secondly, regarding that as an extension, is the value of labor. Even Bernie Sanders used to talk about the need to have a control of borders just for economic reasons, because the moment you start allowing unregulated individual, low cost labor into the market, it lowers the value of everybody. So everybody wants these, we want minimum wage of $10, $15. It can't be sustained by the fact that you're flooding the market with people who will be willing to work for $2 or $3 an hour. So it's this dystopia that they create, again, goes back to the point of government control, because when you get this so far off kilter, the government has to come in and help create the conditions to regulate. So this is all related. And I think that's why you see the Biden administration working. This is not random. This crisis, that's why Kamala Harris hasn't been to the border. It's not like they're concerned about the crisis. They like the crisis. They benefit from this politically. This fits their model of what they want for the rest of America. They want to turn America into California. So there you go. That's my view.
I think more than the border and immigration, what's being done here is eroding the concept of the nation state altogether. That allows, again, for unelected people at the top to have even more power, especially over people in a government that they aren't a part of. What do we see happen in the European Union? Basically, is that unelected bureaucrats from one part of Europe are making decisions about the lives of people in a sovereign state all the way across the continent. I think it's a perfect example of the danger of globalism and what happens when the sovereignty of citizens is eroded through the demonization and the destruction of the concept of a nation state. And by the way, it's a good thing that we have nation states, because just like the states in our federal government that can compete for the best ideas and through competition create better societies, the same thing happens on the world stage. And some countries get things right and some countries get things wrong. And for a long time, America had it very right that people, the individual, should be their own sovereign, that ideas should be free to discuss, and that people's ultimate decision-making authority should rest in the hands of the individual. And I think that there are people who look at that and want to diminish that idea on the world stage and have control over more of Americans' lives and more of the lives of people around the world. And they're going to do that through the destruction of the concept of the nation state in the hearts and minds of people. And they're going to do that through very deceptive tactics also, like making it a case about immigration. I mean, look, both sides want immigration to happen, right? There's no political party against immigration. There's debate over the way to keep it organized and fair. But they're trying to deceptively say, oh no, one side's against immigration. And I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is that obviously it's the nation state that's under attack.
If I can piggyback on that, Brian, I would submit that there is a gigantic, if you will, conflict here, and the question is the question between centralization and subsidiarity. The question of decisions being made either at lowest level possible, your town council, your local school board, or made at a higher level. And the the direction that we are headed in, at least from the government, as you just so accurately put it, Brian, is towards not a nationalization of all these solutions, but an internationalization of all these solutions. That in the end, and this has been stated openly, in the end, they want a global government, and the global government would decide everything. They would set standards. So they would set standards not simply for how the market works, not that there really would be a true free market, but how the controlled market would work, how the energy markets would work, what crops would be grown when. But those sets of rules would expand continually until you would have an international standard on how a house is built. You would have an international standard on how roads are built and where roads are built and what kind of houses are built. Are there single family houses or multiple family houses? Will there be a local school board? No, there'll be a centralized school board. It may be located, for all we know, it may be located in Vienna, but there will be an international standard, a global standard for everything, and you will be required to comply with that standard. Now, if you think that's a good idea, then go along with this. But if you don't think that, if you think that you as a parent, for example, should have a right to challenge what's being taught to your third grader, then you can't agree with this process. You have to push back. If you think that you should have a right to agree, or rather to challenge what kind of business is allowed in your neighborhood, then you need to push back. Those simple decisions, the simple decisions of what happens next to you, are being taken away from you. That is the whole point. That is the end result of this end of the nation state and the creation of essentially a global government, is to deprive you of your ability to affect your life, your livelihood, your neighborhood directly.
Yeah, Pete, that's a great point. And it's funny, if someone were to look at our conversation here out of context, they might think we were discussing the plot of a George Orwell novel. We're responding to the written, desires and visions put out by people talking about this Great Reset, to Klaus Schwab's book, and people in Davos and other political platforms and policies that have these written stated goals of doing these things like internationalizing decision making, reducing the power of the free market, taking choice away from people. So it's sad that we're at this point, but everybody needs to understand the argument so that they understand just how incredibly unfar-fetched this is, and can make up their mind on it and speak, push back against it.
The question is, does Build Back Better really mean Santa Claus is coming to town? Thank you for being with us on this installment of the London Center for Policy Research's Thought to Action Great Reset Roundtable. We'll be producing more in this series, but if you'd like to watch the first two GRTs, hey, everybody else is initializing their names in their shows. We can do it too. Find them on our YouTube channel, on Rumble, Dailymotion, and website as well. Our website, londoncenter.org. Also, feel free to like, share, and comment on this video. We would like to know what you think. And hit that subscribe button as well as that bell. And join us on Patreon for sneak previews and exclusive content. Patreon.com/thoughttoaction. For our panelists and the London Center for Policy Research, once again, thank you for listening.